returning to the peaceful American suburb. After more than a decade away, Sarah finally found herself cruising along the winding, tree-lined roads of Old Pine Hill, Connecticut, a classic American suburb where neat, freshly painted mailbox posts lined the sidewalks and lawns looked untouched under the late afternoon sun. Fall was just beginning to show. Golden leaves clung to maples, the breeze carrying a slight crispness that signaled the end of summer. Gazing out of the windshield, Sarah felt a wave of nostalgia and unease wash over her. Each turn reminded her of the younger version of herself, eager to please, desperate to fit into a family that seemed perfect from the outside, but hid deeper cracks beneath its pristine surface. Her rented sports car stood out among the minivans and pickup trucks, parked in driveway after driveway. Yet nothing seemed to have changed since the day she was forced to leave. The neighborhood's serenity was almost haunting, quiet in a way that suggested secrets rather than peace. Sarah slowed as she approached the familiar cul-de-sac at the end of Ridgewood Lane. There, tucked behind high hedges and tall oak trees, stood her family's old colonial mansion, complete with white columns and a broad wraparound porch. The site was exactly as she remembered, only now she felt like a stranger, returning to a place she once called home. Sarah parked by the curb, her heart pounding harder than she'd expected. She took a deep breath, savoring the scent of mown grass mixed with the far-off promise of rain. Rolling down her window, she listened for the laughter of children playing, the distant bark of a dog, the muffled sound of a neighbor's radio. Ordinary sounds that had always comforted her. But today, the familiar noises did little to quell her anxiety. For years, Sarah had built a new life in the relentless clamor of New York City, trading in the quiet predictability of Ridgewood Lane for skyscrapers and subways. She had tried to forget the pain of her abrupt departure, the sharp words and cold silences that had forced her out. Now she was back, and the facade of tranquility in this genteel suburb only reminded her that appearances could be deceiving. The sun dipped below the trees as she finally stepped out of the car, her heels crunching against the gravel. In her hand, she gripped the key to the front door, mailed to her weeks ago, but left unopened until this very morning. Sarah straightened her posture, set her shoulders, and let herself absorb the stillness one last time before crossing the threshold into the life and the family she'd left behind. Old wounds, still unhealed. Beneath the polished veneer Sarah presented to the world, scars lingered, raw and aching, no matter how many years had passed. The wounds she carried weren't physical, but emotional, cut deep by the betrayal of those meant to protect and trust her most. Sarah had only been 16 when the world she knew crumbled. Overnight, one crisp November day, a cherished heirloom, a delicate, antique brooch passed down through generations, had vanished from her mother's jewelry box. Accusations flew around the dinner table like daggers, and suspicion quickly fell on Sarah. She still remembered the look in her mother's eyes, not sadness, but cold disappointment, as if Sarah's innocence could be measured only by her silence. Her pleas fell on deaf ears. No one believed her. No one stood up for her. In that moment, Sarah learned that even the closest bonds could shatter under the weight of doubt. Her mother, the matriarch who had seemed unshakable, delivered the harshest punishment, banishment from the home Sarah had known her entire life. Without a chance to explain or to prove her innocence, she was told to pack her bags and leave. The sting of that rejection lingered, an invisible ache that never left, no matter how far she ran. The years following her exile weren't kind. Sarah stumbled through unfamiliar cities, working odd jobs to make ends meet, piecing together a makeshift life while trying desperately to hold on to some sense of dignity. She spent sleepless nights replaying that day over and over, searching for clues, for signs of who the real culprit might be. Haunted by what-ifs and regrets, the unfairness of her situation became a lodestone, shaping every choice she made. It was the ghost that followed her from apartment to apartment, the reason she hesitated before forming close friendships, always wondering when trust would run out again. Even as she found success later in life, the echo of her mother's accusation would ring in her ears during quiet moments. Sarah told herself she was stronger for it. Yet she knew these wounds had never truly healed. Returning to her childhood home now, every step stirred up old pain. Buried, but not forgotten. The house, the trees, even the scent in the air. Everything seemed to conspire to remind her of how quickly love could turn sour, how family could transform into strangers. And though she wore confidence like armor, Sarah knew there were cracks beneath the surface that had never, perhaps could never, fully close. The successful woman returns. Years after her forced departure from Old Pine Hill, Sarah Harper had transformed herself into a name to be reckoned with in the high-stakes world of New York City business. The city had become her proving ground, a relentless, unyielding place where only the most determined survived. What had begun as necessity, answering phones at a temp agency, grabbing whatever jobs she could to pay rent in cramped apartments, had over time become strategic ambition. Sarah worked through long nights and early mornings, her determination fueled by the need to prove, to herself as much as to the world, that she was more than the sum of a single accusation. Building her career brick by brick, Sarah took risks where others saw roadblocks. She learned the nuances of corporate politics and boardroom negotiations, made allies and outmaneuvered rivals with her intelligence, grit, and unwavering resolve. A keen sense of intuition, sharpened by years of defending herself, became her greatest asset, allowing her to read situations and people with uncanny precision. By the time she was 30, Sarah had risen to a high-ranking executive position at a tech firm with offices overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Her name featured in industry magazines. She wore elegance and confidence as naturally as a second skin. On the surface, she projected the image of a self-made woman who had never looked back. Armani suits, decisive voice, an apartment filled with panoramic city views and modern art, all hallmarks of a life remade from nothing. Colleagues and rivals alike admired her perseverance and respected her boundaries, never guessing at the history that lay buried beneath. Even her closest friends knew only fragments of what had sent her running from Ridgewood Lane all those years ago. And yet, with every promotion or public recognition, Sarah felt a deeper yearning simmer beneath the pride. She attended galas with a practiced smile, but inside, she wondered if the world saw the real her, or just the persona she had crafted. Her success was hard-won, but the sense of injustice, the memory of her mother's cold accusation, and her family's abandonment was never far away. It lingered, quietly fueling her drive, but also leaving her nights occasionally restless. News of her family's recent troubles had arrived through old friends and the occasional curious journalist. A legal dispute, whispers of inheritance and secrets. Though she'd told herself she was finished with Old Pine Hill, she knew deep down that unfinished business remained, not just for vindication, but for closure and truth. Returning to her hometown wasn't just about confronting the past. It was about reclaiming her story on her own terms. Sarah's return was not the work of a wounded girl, but the calculated decision of a woman who had built her strength from adversity. She would face her family, not for revenge, not simply to prove them wrong, but to finally draw her own lines. Whatever secrets remained buried in the stately halls of her childhood home, she was ready to bring them to light, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been silenced by those they loved. Unveiling family secrets, Sarah's return to Old Pine Hill was met with polite curiosity and a chill just beneath the surface, like the sudden cold that follows the setting sun on an autumn evening. It was clear from the moment she stepped through the door of the Harper family mansion that things remained unsaid, that her presence disturbed a fragile equilibrium painstakingly constructed in her absence. Yet, beneath the awkward pleasantries and brittle small talk, Sarah noticed cracks forming in her family's facade, cracks she intended to pry open in her search for truth. She moved through the rooms that had once defined her childhood, carefully observing the choreography of her family's daily life. Her mother, as always, was the orchestrator, poised and seemingly unflappable, her smile a shield as she maintained conversations that never lingered on uncomfortable subjects. Her father, quieter than she remembered, seemed to shrink away from confrontation, avoiding eye contact, burying himself in finances, newspapers, or work calls. Her younger brother, now a grown man, sported a veneer of confidence, but his restless movements and sidelong glances told another story. Sarah noticed the small differences first, the way cabinet doors were locked that never used to be, the hurried way her mother changed the subject if anyone mentioned the past. Throughout her first week, Sarah's questions about her childhood or the missing brooch, always cloaked in innocent nostalgia, were met with silence or an abrupt change in topic. Family photos still decorated the walls, yet certain gaps in the timeline betrayed moments the family would rather forget. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. At family dinners, conversation would inevitably stall when Sarah asked about specific events from years ago. Her mother's hands would tighten around her wine glass. Her father would clear his throat, and her brother would scribble patterns on his napkin or text under the table. When Sarah caught his eye, there was a fleeting flash of guilt. Or was it fear? Before he looked away, Sarah began to catalog these tiny reactions, fitting them together like shards of a shattered vase. She spent her days reacquainting herself with the estate, revisiting childhood hideouts, peering into attics and drawers that held relics of another life. In the mornings, she jogged through the crisp air of Ridgewood Lane, hoping to bump into old neighbors and listen for rumors, half-truths, and village gossip. In the evenings, she studied the rhythm of the household, who left the house when, who called whom, and who avoided whom. It didn't take long for her to sense that more was at stake than a single missing heirloom. She came across receipts for expensive jewelry purchases made after the brooch had vanished, a strange replacement, or a cover-up. She discovered emails on the family computer, partially deleted, that hinted at blackmail and desperate financial negotiations. Once, while passing her brother's partially open door, Sarah heard him whispering frantically on the phone, assuring someone that she doesn't know anything yet. He fell silent immediately when Sarah stepped into view. The servants, too, had stories to tell, each one cautious, but some clearly sympathetic to Sarah's cause. Mrs. Lyons, the longtime housekeeper, let slip one afternoon that the missing brooch was not the only thing to have disappeared from the house over the years. "Things have a way of walking off," she said, shooting a significant glance toward the living room, where Sarah's brother sprawled on the couch. Sarah's mother grew increasingly tense as Sarah lingered around corners, asked probing questions at the dinner table, and began helping organize boxes in the attic. One morning, as Sarah gently pressed her for details about the fateful night the brooch disappeared, her mother's carefully practiced composure snapped. "Why must you dig up the past? We have moved on. You should too." The sudden harshness in her tone, the way her hands shook as she arranged a vase of white lilies, betrayed a fear that was almost palpable. Every interaction with her family felt like a game of chess. Her brother was the master of deflection, spinning childhood anecdotes into distractions whenever the conversation edged toward uncomfortable territory. But he was careless, too. Sarah soon noticed missing household cash and found evidence of late-night escapades covered up by morning lies. She became convinced that his charm masked a nervousness rooted in secrets. Sarah tried to foster alliances where she could. Her father, although emotionally withdrawn, responded to her gentle questioning with resigned honesty on rare occasions. Over cups of late-night tea, he confessed that he no longer understood his own family, that mistakes had been made in the name of protecting reputations and peace. It was a gossamer thread of connection, but it illuminated the underlying chaos that had taken hold in the years since Sarah's exile. The more Sarah pried, the clearer it became that her family's respectability was a thin veil stretched over decades of secrecy. It wasn't just the loss of a brooch or money. There were old affairs, debts, and blackmail attempts swept under expensive rugs and hidden behind prestigious alumni certificates. Sarah's mother wielded reputation like a weapon, quick to silence scandal at any cost, while her brother seemed willing to let others take the blame for his transgressions. The pivotal break came late one night when a storm rolled in from the coast, battering the colonial home with wind and rain. As thunder rattled the windows, Sarah found her brother pacing anxiously in the downstairs den. She confronted him outright, laying out everything she had discovered: his involvement in petty theft around the house, the hush money withdrawn from family accounts, his panicked phone calls and lies. Cornered, her brother oscillated between bluster and panic, until finally, the truth slipped out. It hadn't been Sarah who had taken the brooch all those years ago. He confessed that, desperate to impress a girlfriend and short on cash, he'd pawned the heirloom, convinced his mother would never notice. When panic had set in, he'd let suspicion spiral toward his older sister and remained silent as she bore the brunt of the family's wrath. It was a grotesque relief. The tension that had haunted the Harper home dissipated by degrees, replaced by a heavy silence as her brother's confession echoed through the halls. Still, the hardest confrontation, Sarah's face-to-face reckoning with her mother, was yet to come. But as dawn broke through the stormy clouds, Sarah felt the weight on her shoulders lighten just a little. The house she once loved was heavy with history, yet her determination had finally begun to peel back the layers of deception, setting the truth free. No matter how far she had run, Sarah now understood. Secrets left unspoken only festered in the dark. With her resolve stronger than ever and the truth finally in hand, she prepared to finish what she had started, determined to ensure her family and the world would know the real story behind the Harper legacy. Confronting her mother and the past, it was inevitable that they would finally face each other. The confrontation between Sarah and her mother was the storm that had been brewing since Sarah's return, a reckoning delayed for more than a decade. It unfolded on a rain-soaked afternoon, lightning flickering beyond the curtained windows of the Harper family's grand but uneasy home. The house was silent, except for the sound of Sarah's footsteps echoing on polished hardwood as she climbed the stairs to her mother's sitting room. She paused at the doorway, nerves dancing through her. A lifetime of words left unsaid thickened the air. Her mother sat at the window, her figure silhouetted by the murky gray light, fussing absently with a string of pearls draped around her neck. Even after everything, she remained the picture of composure and grace, a woman who had built her life around appearances and discipline, rarely allowing her facade to crack. "Mom," her mother looked up, lips tightening as their eyes met. For a brief moment, Sarah saw uncertainty on the face that had always seemed implacable. "Sarah, is something the matter?" Her mother's tone was brisk, almost defensive. As though rehearsed, Sarah stepped into the room and rested her hand on the edge of a mahogany desk, anchoring herself. The memories of her exile, her mother's silence, the look in her eyes, the banishment, fused with the more recent revelation of her brother's confession. Sarah fought to keep her composure. "There's a lot we need to talk about what happened all those years ago, about why you chose to believe the worst of me." Her mother's hands, normally so steady, trembled a little as she placed the pearls back into a velvet box. She let the lid snap shut, as if to signal the end of the conversation before it had even begun. "The past is behind us, Sarah. We don't need to relive it." But her voice was thin. There was fear there, and maybe guilt. Sarah drew a breath and pressed quietly on, refusing to be derailed by old tactics. "It's not behind me. Losing this family broke me, and it was all for something I didn't do. You never even asked me if I was innocent." She stopped, blinking back tears. "You never listened." Her mother's expression flickered with discomfort, but she marshaled herself with practiced elegance. "There were circumstances you did not understand. The brooch was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was part of this family's history. I was responsible for protecting that legacy. Was that legacy ever more important than your daughter?" Sarah's voice sharpened, emotions cracking the careful calm she usually commanded as an executive. "Do you know how it felt when you told me to leave? When nobody in this house believed me? Not Dad, not even my little brother. Who did you think I would become after you sent me away?" The rain battered the windows, underlining the heaviness of the silence that followed. Her mother's facade seemed to falter then, a tremor in her chin, the slow lowering of her eyes. For a long moment she said nothing. Sarah continued, softer, almost pleading. "I needed you, Mom. I needed you more than I'd ever needed anyone. But you turned on me. All these years, I've carried that wound. I've let it shape my life. You taught me to survive, but you also taught me how fragile love can be." Her mother rose from her chair, crossing the room with the dignified gait she had perfected over decades of charity balls and garden parties. Up close, Sarah saw the lines carved by age and worry, and for the first time, she glimpsed the vulnerability beneath. Sarah felt a bitter laugh rise in her chest, but she swallowed it. "You believed it was easier to lose a daughter than face the truth about your son? Was that really the choice you wanted to make?" Her mother's face collapsed inward, shame finally overtaking pride. Tears shimmered, unshed in her eyes, as she grasped for the edge of the desk herself now. "I was wrong. I see that now. I missed you every day, but I was too proud, too afraid to admit I'd made a mistake." A dam broke in Sarah's heart. Years of anger and heartbreak, questions never answered, nights spent wishing her mother would call, would write, would care. Suddenly, there was space for something else, grief, and the distant hope of forgiveness. Her mother's voice trembled, words shaky with regret. I was frightened of what I might discover. It was easier to assign blame quickly, to keep everything under control, to keep our place in this community, our name, our status. I failed you, Sarah. I know that now. Thunder cracked overhead, and for a moment, both women stared at each other, through the shadows and light, across all the time that had been lost. Sarah stepped closer, her anger tempered by the realization of her mother's frailty. I came back because I needed closure. I needed to reclaim my place, not just in this house, but in my own life. I know the truth now. I know what my brother did, but this, the real wound, wasn't just about the brooch. It was about being abandoned by my own family. Her mother started to cry, shoulders shaking, with quiet sobs that she tried and failed to hide. I'm sorry, Sarah. I should have stood by you. I should have believed you. They stood together in silence, the distance between them slowly shrinking, though the years of hurt couldn't be erased in a single afternoon. Still, for the first time since she was 16, Sarah saw that apology in her mother's eyes, the acknowledgement she had yearned for all these years. I've learned how to stand on my own, Sarah said gently, but I shouldn't have had to learn it that way. Maybe, someday, we can learn to be mother and daughter again. Her mother nodded, tears finally falling unchecked. I would like that. I truly would. As the storm raged outside, something within the house eased. It wasn't resolution, not yet, but it was the beginning. The first honest words spoken between mother and daughter in years. And for Sarah, that was enough to quietly reclaim a piece of her soul for the very first time. The truth revealed. The morning after the storm, sunlight filtered softly through the towering oaks that surrounded the Harper estate, casting delicate geometric patterns across the front porch. Inside, however, the mood was anything but tranquil. The confession from Sarah's brother the night before, raw and undeniable, hung heavy in the air, weaving itself into every morning ritual, every glance, every unspoken word. Sarah sat alone at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of coffee she barely tasted. For years, she had imagined this moment. Her name cleared, the heavy shroud of suspicion at last torn away. Yet now that the truth had come to light, relief mingled with sorrow. Vindication felt hollow without the innocence of those lost years, and the wounds within the family could not be stitched closed with a single confession. She wondered how, or even if, they would ever really heal. When her mother entered the kitchen, the transformation was striking. Gone was the unflappable matriarch, so invested in appearances and legacy. In her place was a woman visibly aged overnight, shoulders bent underneath the shame she could no longer hide. She paused briefly in the doorway, uncertain, before setting about the familiar clatter of breakfast. There was a sense of truce, but not peace. Sarah's brother, Ethan, appeared last, his steps tentative and quiet, the brash confidence stripped away, replaced by the wary guilt of someone who has carried a secret for far too long. He could not meet Sarah's eyes. Instead, he busied himself with pouring juice, his every movement weighted and awkward. The family that had once presented a perfect front now seemed fragile, almost childlike in their discomfort. It was Ethan who broke the silence, his voice low, rough with fatigue and remorse. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I'm sorry, Sarah. His eyes darted up, searching, pleading for forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. I don't even remember why I did it. I was stupid and scared. When I realized how badly it had gone, I just tried to disappear into the background. Sarah regarded her brother, searching his face for malice, for denial. for the boy she once loved and the man he had become. She found only uncertainty. "You let me pay the price," she said quietly. "You watched me leave and let them believe it was me. Did you ever want to tell the truth?" Ethan swallowed, shame coloring his cheeks. "A lot of times, but after a while, I convinced myself that maybe it would be worse if I did. I felt like if I said anything, I'd lose everything and ruin the family. So I told myself it was better to stay quiet." Their mother, standing by the stove, turned away, her shoulders shuddering, as the reality of her children's fractured trust struck her anew. "You both lost something because of this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I did too. Not just a brooch, but the love and faith we shared. I wish I could go back." Sarah's heart ached with conflicting emotions: anger, relief, the dull ache of old grief, and the faintest glimmer of hope. "We can't go back," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "But we can choose how to move forward. We have to face what's happened, really face it, not sweep it under the rug again." News traveled fast in Old Pine Hill, especially within circles that thrived on rumor and repute. It was only a matter of time before the story of Sarah's innocence and her brother's confession seeped into the town's consciousness. The Harpers had always been a pillar in the community, their reputation built on tradition, charity, and success. Now, every glance from a neighbor held a flicker of curiosity, every casual greeting tinged with the awareness that the perfect Harper family had cracks running deep beneath the surface. Sarah had known her return would cause ripples, but she had not anticipated how revealing the truth would force the entire town to re-examine its own tendencies toward judgment and false appearances. Old allies of her mother's were now distant, some quietly sympathetic, others privately gloating at the fall of an untouchable family name. The neighbors who had once shut their doors against Sarah as a disgraced teenager now offered her hesitant, sometimes painful apologies. Her father, whose silence had always been the family's background hum, was perhaps the most changed. After the confession, he sought out Sarah in his study, the room heavy with the scent of leather and old paper. He sat across from her, the years creating a canyon that neither quite knew how to bridge. Piece by piece, the story of that distant night came together. Not just the act of theft, but the currents of fear, pride, and selfishness that had swept a family apart. Ethan wrote a letter to Sarah, outlining the details of his actions with complete candor and asking if she would allow him to make her innocence public. Sarah read it by the window, her hand trembling, tears slipping free at the open acknowledgement she'd been denied for so long. It was not only the immediate family who had a role in the drama. The housekeeper, Mrs. Lyons, offered Sarah her own truths, confessing she had always suspected Ethan and had wanted to intervene, but felt powerless in the face of Mrs. Harper's iron will. "No one wants to cross your mother, dear," she admitted, "but I always believed you deserved better." As days passed, the family shifted, awkward and halting, but undeniably in motion. Sarah attended a town hall meeting reluctantly, her name whispered from one row to the next. When asked to speak, she did not tear down her family, but instead told her story plainly, owning her pain and the challenge of forgiveness. "Secrets eat at us more than any scandal ever could," she said. "None of us is perfect. The only way forward is honesty." The act of publicly clearing her name was not about revenge, but liberation. By voicing the truth, Sarah freed herself from the burden of shame her family had imposed. In the weeks that followed, Ethan made amends, returning what he could, owning his mistakes before the community and family alike. Their mother, once so decisive and unyielding, learned the humility of asking for forgiveness, not just from Sarah, but from herself. In the wake of the storm, the Harper family was changed. No longer pristine or untouchable, but slowly, tentatively, they began to rebuild. This time on honesty, acceptance, and the hard-won understanding that truth, however painful, had the power to mend even the oldest wounds. For Sarah, that was the redemption she had longed for, not simply to be proven right, but to reclaim her place in the world, finally free of the shadow of a lie. Sweet revenge and letting go. In the aftermath of truth, retribution lingered at the edges of every conversation and every gaze. As word rippled through Old Pine Hill, swelling through tidy hedges and whispering across church socials, the Harper family home became a silent epicenter for scandal and speculation. For Sarah, the days that followed her brother's confession and the public clearing of her name offered her a strange and ambiguous power. The kind that comes when the truth finally swings in your favor, when those who doubted you suddenly find themselves on the other side of judgment. Yet, despite years spent imagining how vindication would feel, how she'd relish the opportunity to watch those who wronged her squirm, Sarah found her triumph tinged with a surprising sense of emptiness. In the city, where power games had been a currency and payback a quiet strategy, she'd believed that victory meant standing over the ruins of an adversary. But here, in the familiar, haunted halls of her childhood, revenge seemed more complicated. The people before her weren't faceless opponents. They were her, mother and brother, the neighbors who once babysat her, the classmates who had mocked her shame. Sarah stood at her bedroom window, watching a pair of blue jays battle over a scrap of bread on the back lawn. The house felt different now. The walls lighter, the air transformed by the storm of confessions and the breaking of secrets. Every interaction with her family was raw, cautious, and genuinely new. There was no script for such aftermaths. The confidence she'd cultivated in corporate New York could not ameliorate the trembling, human experience of finally being seen. The town's reaction was as severe as it was swift. Some old friends reached out awkwardly, offering hesitant apologies for memories they barely owned. A few sought her out at the grocery store or the tiny library, voices lowered in embarrassment as they recalled the rumors they'd believed, the invitations rescinded, the silence they'd offered instead of support. Others avoided her altogether, choosing distance over the discomfort of contrition. There were some, too, who gossiped with subtle glee, satisfied in the knowledge that beneath every white picket fence lurked a story just like hers. Sarah could have wielded her newfound truth like a weapon. There were opportunities. The local newspaper asked for an exclusive, hoping to detail her return, her brother's guilt, her mother's downfall. Legal action was a real possibility. She could have pressed charges, initiated lawsuits, or demanded restitution for her lost years, her tarnished reputation, the emotional and financial costs she had borne alone. If she wished, Sarah could have become a symbol, petitions, speaking engagements, a memoir contract about surviving toxic family secrets. But the confrontation with her mother had changed her, seeing the exhaustion and regret etched into her mother's face, the fragility behind the woman's iron reputation. Sarah finally understood that the most profound consequence was not financial or social, but emotional, a legacy of loneliness, regret, and ambiguous loss. Her brother, stripped of bravado, had nothing left to give her except apology, his grief for what he'd done as real as her own. There had already been so much lost between them. years they would never share, laughter that could not be reclaimed. Slowly, Sarah came to see that revenge, no matter how justified, would only keep her tethered to that pain. What she truly craved was not punishment, but peace, an unburdening, a reclaiming of her story on her own terms. The sweet taste of revenge was fleeting, but the freedom offered by forgiveness, even if unconditional, was something else entirely. She thought of all the nights she'd lain awake in lonely city apartments, replaying her banishment, wishing for just one chance to set the record straight. Now, with the record finally balanced, she was surprised to find herself longing only for release. In private moments, she spoke bluntly and honestly with her family. To her brother, she said, "You took years from me, Ethan. There's no undoing that. But I can't walk around angry forever. I just hope, for both our sakes, you use the rest of your life to do better." He nodded, grateful for mercy, but fully aware it might take years for their relationship to heal, if it healed at all. Her mother, still reeling from the collapse of her carefully constructed world, clung to Sarah in ways both desperate and tender. "I can never repay what I cost you," she said quietly one evening. "But I want to try, if you will let me." For the first time, Sarah truly believed her. They agreed to start slowly, emails, calls, an occasional breakfast. Boundaries were set, but so too was hope. Sarah's choice to forego revenge in its traditional sense was not made in weakness, but in strength, in the hard-won knowledge that to let go was to free herself from a story she never chose, from wounds that could otherwise define her forever. She sat down with the local paper, not for drama or exposure, but to gently reclaim her narrative. Sometimes, families are broken by secrets. Mine was. But truth is the best gift I could have given myself, and forgiveness is my decision. The article ran, free of scandalous detail, a portrait not of victims and villains, but of people trying, imperfectly, to make things right. Before leaving Old Pine Hill for good, Sarah visited the old maple out back where she had once buried time capsules as a child. She unearthed a tin box containing a friendship bracelet, an old photo, and a letter to her future self. A letter written by a hopeful, innocent girl who still believed the world was safe. Sarah smiled sadly, reread her own words, and placed a new letter beside the old, one about resilience, about forgiveness, about refusing to let bitterness root itself in a place meant for healing. On her final morning, she walked Ridgewood Lane, the October chill bright and invigorating. Neighbors waved, some warmly, others hesitantly, but Sarah responded to each with genuine, if quiet, goodwill. She wondered if she'd ever return again, or if this homecoming would be her last. It didn't matter. What mattered was what she left behind, not a person defined by accusation or exile, but a woman who wrote her own ending. Driving away, Sarah glanced at the mansion in her rearview mirror. She felt lighter than she had in years, no longer haunted by what she'd lost or who she'd had to become. She embraced the truth, the pain, and the flawed humanity of those who had shaped her. But she chose, finally, to move forward unchained. Her revenge, if any, was in her freedom, her victory in letting go.